Before we dive into today's journey, have you ever experienced something strange while out camping? Share your story in the comments below, and let's build this haven of eerie campfire tales together. My name's Jonathan Martin, and this all happened back in 2014, deep in Shenandoah National Park. If you asked me, I'd tell you RV camping is just another way to avoid setting up a tent. But when you've got 3 days off work and a new trailer hitched up, it's hard to resist the call of the road. So there I was, 35, feeling more like an overgrown Boy Scout, setting out for a solo weekend in the wilderness. The thing is, I'm not exactly the roughing it type, but I guess I needed to prove something to myself. The drive was supposed to be simple, just a few hours from Roanoke. I figured Shenandoah was quiet enough to give me the solitude I wanted without running into any wannabe survivalists who mistake every rustling branch for Bigfoot. But by the time I parked the trailer, I realized just how isolated the place was. I picked a spot about a mile off the main loop, tucked into a clearing that was practically begging to be haunted. No cell service, no other campers in sight, just me and the endless stretch of trees. As the evening stretched on, I settled into the kind of peace you only get when you're far enough away from everything. I cracked open a beer, threw a few sausages on the portable grill, and kicked back in my folding chair, admiring the quiet. I kept telling myself this was exactly what I wanted. But there's something about real silence that gets to you. It's like your mind starts filling the emptiness with things that aren't there. Or maybe they are there, just hiding. Somewhere around midnight, I heard it. It was subtle at first, a low humming barely audible over the soft breeze. I told myself it was the wind, but it didn't quite sit right. I strained my ears and the sound got clearer, a dull, rhythmic tapping like someone drumming their fingers on metal. I scanned around the trailer, but there was nothing. Nothing but trees and shadow swallowing up everything the lantern didn't reach. Then it stopped. In the stillness that followed, I felt something worse than fear. It was the kind of dread that sneaks in when you realize there might be someone watching you. I stepped inside the RV, locked the door, and dimmed the lights, convincing myself it was just a curious animal. After all, bears wander through these woods, right? It was easier to imagine a bear pawing at my trailer than some stranger lurking around waiting for, well, I didn't want to think about what someone might be waiting for. It wasn't long before I heard it again, but this time closer. The taps had turned into a more purposeful, unsettling rhythm, like someone was knocking on metal with a rock. They were coming from the front of the RV right by the door. I crept up to the window, keeping low, and peeked out. I could see nothing, just my empty campsite and the pitch black beyond it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. By then, I'd had enough. I pulled out the knife I'd packed mostly for show and gripped it tight, feeling ridiculous but oddly reassured. I debated calling out, maybe warning whoever or whatever it was that I was armed. But in the silence of those woods, the idea of making a noise felt like an invitation. I didn't get a chance to decide, though, because the knocking shifted again, this time moving to the back of the RV. This was no animal. I knew that now. I forced myself to peek out the small back window, and that's when I saw him. A man stood just a few feet from the trailer, holding something in his hand. A crowbar, or maybe an iron pipe, I couldn't tell. He was lanky, almost gaunt, with an awkward posture like he'd forgotten how to stand properly. His clothes looked frayed, caked with mud, or something worse. But it was his face that got me. He was grinning, a slow, crooked grin like he just heard the punchline to a joke he wasn't going to share. He raised his hand, tapping the metal pipe against the RV in that same rhythmic pattern, like he wanted me to hear it. I ducked down, holding my breath. What the hell was he doing out here? This was supposed to be the middle of nowhere. 1,000 questions raced through my mind, but none of them mattered as much as one simple thought. I had to get out. There was no way I was spending the night with that guy circling my trailer like a buzzard. With my hands shaking, I grabbed my keys and eased toward the driver's seat, praying he hadn't seen me. I started the engine, hoping the sudden roar would scare him off. But as I looked up, I saw him, standing right in front of the RV, just outside the windshield, staring directly at me with that twisted grin. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. Just stood there, holding the metal pipe is blocking my only way out. I revved the engine, hoping he'd get the message, but he didn't budge. For a moment, I thought about flooring it, plowing right through him. But something in his expression told me he was counting on that reaction, like he'd played this game before and he knew exactly how it ended. I don't know how long I sat there, locked in that silent standoff, but eventually he backed away, just a few steps. Enough for me to see he wasn't alone. Another figure emerged from the trees, just as lanky and disturbing as the first, carrying something even larger, a machete. The two of them exchanged glances, and in that moment, I realized this wasn't random. They'd been planning this. Desperation took over. I threw the RV into reverse, flooring it without looking back, barely caring where I was headed as long as it was away from them. The trailer jolted and rocked as I sped down the narrow dirt path, branches scratching against the sides like nails on a chalkboard. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the engine over it, but they were following me. In the side mirror, I could see them running, keeping pace with the RV like they'd done it 1,000 times before. Their footsteps were quick, relentless, and every time I thought I was losing them, they'd appear again, like shadows stretching longer with the moonlight. Somehow I reached the main road. I don't remember how long I drove or when I finally pulled over. All I knew was that I had to get away, put as much distance as I could between myself and those maniacs. The cops didn't believe much of it, of course. They chalked it up to an overactive imagination, mixed with a city boy who'd underestimated the isolation of Shenandoah. They didn't find anyone, naturally, and probably didn't look too hard either. Just another tale for the campfire, they said. A week later, though, I read something in the local paper. 2 hikers had gone missing from the same area, last seen on a trail not far from where I camped. And when they finally found them, well, let's just say they hadn't been alone in those woods. Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world. It started on a pretty typical Monday in 2010 in the backwoods of Dunsmuir, California. My name's Samuel Ford, and I don't usually get involved in stuff like this. I'm more of a live and let live kind of guy, you know? Anyway, it all kicked off when I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. I was dealing with some personal stuff, nothing major, just the usual life's got you down kind of crap. So there I was, wandering through the trees, thinking about everything and nothing. The morning was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves. Dunsmuir is known for its rugged beauty, lots of trees, rivers, and peace. Perfect for someone needing to get lost in their thoughts. I was halfway up one of the lesser-known trails when I spotted it, a cabin I hadn't seen before. Now, I've hiked these trails for years, and never once did I come across this place. I wasn't armed, just had a Swiss Army knife and a lot of curiosity. What's a guy like me going to do with a gun anyway? The cabin looked old, almost like it had been there for decades. The wood was weathered, windows covered in grime. There was no path leading to it, which was odd. Maybe it was abandoned. My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I stepped onto the creaky porch and gave it a gentle push. It swung open with a long, eerie creak. I'm not the type to go snooping around other people's property, but this place seemed forgotten. Inside, it was dark and musty, filled with old furniture draped in dust sheets. The whole vibe was straight out of a horror movie, but I wasn't scared, more intrigued than anything. I wandered through the rooms, noticing old photographs on the walls, black and white, mostly of landscapes and a few people. One picture caught my eye. It was of a family standing right outside this cabin. They looked happy, but something about their eyes gave me the creeps. Just then, I heard it. A faint shuffling noise coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. Common sense would tell anyone to get the hell out of there. But me? I decided to investigate. I slowly climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under my weight. At the top, the noise was clearer, like someone dragging something across the floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the only light coming from a cracked window at the end. I followed the sound to a closed door on the right. I hesitated, hand hovering over the knob, then, summoning whatever courage I had, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, probably a kid's room once upon a time. There were toys scattered around, an old bed against the wall, and there in the middle of the room was a figure hunched over something on the floor. It was big, covered in what looked like fur. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. It turned around slowly, revealing a face that was more animal than human. A snout, sharp teeth, but humanoid eyes staring right through me. Before I could react, it lunged at me. I managed to sidestep, but not before it raked its claws across my arm. The pain was sharp, intense. I stumbled back, clutching my bleeding arm. The creature snarled and came at me again. This time I was ready. I grabbed a wooden chair and swung it with all my might. It shattered against the creature's head, stunning it for a moment. I took my chance and bolted, out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the cabin. My mind was racing. What the hell was that thing? I had to get out of there, warn someone. I ran down the trail, blood dripping from my arm. The adrenaline kept me going, but I knew I needed to get help soon. I reached the trailhead and jumped into my truck. I sped down the dirt road toward town, my mind still reeling from the encounter. I burst into the sheriff's office, babbling about the creature and the cabin. Sheriff Maxwell, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense attitude, looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Samuel, you sure you didn't just spook yourself?" he asked, eyeing my bloody arm. "I'm telling you, Max, there's something out there. It's not human. It attacked me," I insisted, my voice shaking. He sighed and grabbed his radio. "All right, let's go take a look." We drove back to the cabin, me in the passenger seat, clutching my makeshift bandage. Maxwell didn't say much, probably thinking I was crazy. When we arrived, the place looked just as eerie as before. I led him to the room where I'd seen the creature. The door was still open, but the room was empty. No sign of the creature, just blood. My blood on the floor. Maxwell looked around, frowning. "Whatever you saw, it's gone now. But we can't just leave it at that. We need to find out what's going on." We spent the rest of the day searching the area, finding nothing. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was it all a hallucination? Wouldn't try, but the pain in my arm and the blood said otherwise. Maxwell decided to call in some experts, figuring it might be a wild animal, though I knew it was something far more sinister. Later that evening, as we sat in the sheriff's office, a man walked in. He was tall, with a rugged face and piercing eyes. Introduced himself as Dr. Leon Voss, an anthropologist specializing in cryptids and folklore. "I heard about your encounter," he said, looking at me with interest. "Mind if I ask you some questions?" We went over the details again, and he listened intently. "What you describe sounds like a legend I've heard before. Locals call it the Wendigo, a creature said to be a former human who resorted to cannibalism and transformed into a beast." I shook my head. It looked like some kind of Bigfoot, but more vicious, more human. Voss nodded. "The lines between myth and reality are often blurred, but I believe you saw something real, something dangerous." Over the next few hours, Voss, Maxwell, and I planned to return to the cabin at dawn. We gathered supplies, flashlights, and weapons. I borrowed a shotgun from the sheriff's armory, figuring it might even the odds. I was determined to face whatever it was, partly out of fear, but also a strange sense of responsibility. The next morning, we made our way back to the cabin. The woods seemed darker, more foreboding. As we approached, Voss motioned for us to stay quiet. We moved silently, weapons at the ready. Inside, the cabin was just as we left it, but something felt off, a heaviness in the air. We split up, each taking a different part of the house. I went back upstairs, heart pounding in my chest. The kids' room was still empty, but I felt like I was being watched. Suddenly, a crash from downstairs sent me running back. I found Voss and Maxwell in the living room, staring at a broken window. "It's here," Voss whispered, clutching a flashlight and a pistol. "Stay close." We moved outside, scanning the tree line. Then we saw it, the creature, lurking at the edge of the woods. It stood there, watching us with those unnerving eyes. I raised my shotgun, but Voss put a hand on my arm. "Wait, let's see what it does." The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It sniffed the air, then let out a low, guttural snarl. Without warning, it charged. Maxwell fired, hitting it in the shoulder, but it barely flinched. It was on us in seconds. I fired my shotgun, the blast echoing through the trees. The creature recoiled, blood spraying from its side. Voss shouted, "Keep firing," as he unloaded his pistol into the beast. Maxwell reloaded his rifle, taking aim. The creature lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. I struggled to keep it at bay, its claws tearing at my clothes. Just as it went for my throat, Maxwell's rifle cracked and the creature slumped to the ground, dead. I lay there, breathing hard, staring at the lifeless body. It looked even more monstrous up close, a grotesque blend of human and animal. Voss knelt beside me, checking my wounds. "You're lucky," he said, helping me to my feet. "But we need to get out of here. There might be more of them." We hurried back to the truck, leaving the cabin and its horrors behind. As we drove back to town, the reality of what happened started to sink in. Maxwell radioed for backup, and soon the area was swarming with law enforcement and wildlife experts. They found no other creatures, but the body was taken for study. My name is Gary Ellis, and it was 2020 when I found myself in the dense pines of the Shenandoah National Park in British Columbia. I've been a solo camper for years, but this time I decided to rent an old RV and drive as far as the roads would take me. It was supposed to be a week of fishing, hiking, and generally escaping the buzz of daily life. But, life has a way of giving you just the opposite of what you expect. I was about 3 days in when things started to get a bit strange. The first night was mostly uneventful, save for the usual creaks and groans of an RV settling in after a long drive. By the second night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was near my campsite. I kept hearing crunching noises outside, like someone was slowly stepping on twigs and leaves. I dismissed it, reasoning that it was probably an animal. After all, the park was known for its wildlife. However, on the third day, I woke up to find deep footprints around the RV. Human footprints. I'm not easily spooked, but there was something unsettling about knowing someone had been outside while I was asleep, close enough to touch the door. I scanned the area, hoping to catch sight of whoever it was, but the woods were still and silent, almost unnaturally so. Later that afternoon, I decided to do a little fishing by the river to clear my head. It was about a 20-minute hike from my campsite, and I figured if there was anyone lurking nearby, I'd probably be able to spot them along the way. But I was wrong. The entire area felt abandoned, and as I cast my line, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not wanting to freak myself out, I kept my focus on the water. That's when I heard it, a soft laugh. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe even a bird, but it was too deliberate. It sent a chill down my back. I scanned the tree line, but nothing, just miles of trees standing as silent witnesses to whatever was lurking out there. Returning to my campsite, I found something that sent a jolt of panic through me. My campsite was in total disarray. The firewood I'd collected was scattered, the tarp I'd used for shade was ripped, and my belongings had been rifled through. The strangest part? Whoever did this had left a single Polaroid picture on the ground. It was a photo of me, asleep in the RV the previous night. I won't lie, I panicked. I grabbed my hatchet, the only weapon I had, and immediately started scanning the woods for any sign of movement. There was no one. Nothing but endless trees, the faint rustle of leaves, and the smell of pine. I thought about leaving right then and there, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon everything I'd brought. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound, every crackle, every gust of wind felt like a threat. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside the RV. My grip tightened on the hatchet as I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then the knock. 3 slow, steady taps on the door. I stayed silent, heart pounding, wondering if I should answer or keep quiet. The knocking stopped after a few moments and everything went silent again. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching my hatchet and listening, but the footsteps didn't return. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things, determined to get out of there before things got worse. But as I started the RV, I noticed something strange. The brake line had been cut. Whoever was out there wanted to make sure I stayed. I tried calling for help, but there was no signal. That left me with 2 options: wait for someone to pass by, which could take days, or hike out on foot and leave the RV behind. Reluctantly, I packed a bag with the essentials, took my hatchet, and started the trek down the trail, hoping I'd run into someone soon. I'd only been walking for about an hour when I heard it again. That laugh. This time it was closer and unmistakably human. I spun around, gripping the hatchet tightly, but there was no one there. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the eerie feeling crawling up my spine. The laugh followed me, echoing through the trees, taunting me. After a while, I noticed a shadow moving in my periphery. I didn't stop to look. I just kept moving, keeping my eyes on the trail. But the shadow grew closer, almost matching my pace. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and I turned around, brandishing the hatchet. There he was, a man, standing just a few feet away. He wore an old, tattered jacket and had scruffy, unkempt hair. He looked like he hadn't seen a bed or a shower in months. He stared at me with a grin, almost like he was amused by my reaction. "You lost, friend?" he asked, his voice smooth and mocking. "I'm just passing through," I said, keeping the hatchet in front of me. "Not looking for trouble." He took a step closer, unfazed by my warning. "Trouble finds everyone eventually." His words hung in the air, thick with menace. Without waiting, I turned and started walking again. Faster this time. He followed me, his footsteps crunching the leaves in a deliberate, taunting rhythm. I didn't look back, just kept moving, hoping he'd lose interest. But every time I thought I'd put some distance between us, he'd appear again, his grin widening as if he was enjoying the game. It was starting to get dark, and I knew I needed to find shelter. I stumbled upon an old ranger cabin, long abandoned and half buried in foliage. The windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges, but it was better than being out in the open. I rushed inside, slamming the door shut and wedging a broken chair against it for good measure. I waited in the silence, listening for any sign of him. Minutes passed, maybe even an hour. Just when I thought I was safe, the laughter started again, this time right outside the cabin. "You think you can hide?" His voice was barely a whisper, but I could feel it creeping under my skin. I gripped the hatchet, preparing for whatever would come next. There was a loud bang as he kicked at the door, the chair barely holding it shut. My heart raced as I backed away, realizing that I had no other way out. The banging continued, each kick growing more forceful, until the door finally gave way. He stepped inside, his grin now a full, twisted smile. "This has been fun," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I swung the hatchet, desperate and fueled by fear. He dodged, laughing, as he grabbed my arm and twisted it, forcing the hatchet from my hand. I fought back, kicking and punching, but he was stronger, fueled by whatever twisted motivation drove him. Just when I thought it was over, I managed to grab a broken piece of wood from the floor and jabbed it into his side. He let out a grunt, momentarily stunned, and I took the chance to run. I bolted out of the cabin, not looking back, my only thought to put as much distance between us as possible. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. By some miracle, a park ranger's truck was driving by, and I waved it down, breathless and panicked. The ranger took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told him about the man, the footprints, the photo, everything. He assured me they'd look into it and gave me a ride back to town. A few days later, I got a call from the ranger. They'd searched the area and found the cabin, along with something chilling. Dozens of Polaroid photos scattered across the floor. Each one showed different campers who had stayed in the park over the years. Some of them looked just like me, terrified and running. They never found the man. The road into the Adar Andax was long, winding, and empty, just how I liked it. After a few hours of driving, I pulled the RV off the narrow trail and into a small clearing by the lake. The pines stretched high and thick around me, their dark needles blending into the overcast sky. This was exactly what I needed, complete isolation. No people, no noise, just the quiet of the forest and the sound of my own thoughts. I parked the RV, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant ripple of water. Perfect. This place would give me the quiet I craved, a chance to think without the distractions of civilian life. Ever since leaving the military, I'd been chasing peace, and this felt like it could be the spot where I'd finally find it. I grabbed my gear and went about setting up camp. It didn't take long. I'd done this enough times to know the routine: gather firewood, get a small fire going, and make sure the RV was ready for a night out in the wilderness. As I made my way through the trees, something caught my eye. On one of the nearby trunks, there was a strange marking, a crude carving of a figure, long and thin, etched into the bark. I frowned, running my fingers over it. Just a kid's prank, I figured. Probably a bored hiker from weeks ago. But as I moved through the forest gathering wood, I found more of them. Carved figures on the trees, all tall and slender, stretching higher than any human could reach. It was strange, but I wasn't here to think about strange things. I was here to forget. By the time the sun set, the fire was crackling softly, casting flickering light across the clearing. I settled in, next to the warmth, staring out at the darkening forest. There was a peace in the solitude, something comforting about being alone with the sounds of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. The forest was too quiet. No rustling leaves, no night animals scurrying about, just silence. And then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. I shook my head. "You're just on edge," I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the tension building in my chest. The wilderness could play tricks on you if you let it. I knew that better than most. I was here to clear my head, not to let it run wild. But then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, just for a split second, something moved, tall, thin, just beyond the trees. I jumped to my feet, gripping the flashlight tighter, and aimed the beam toward where I'd seen the figure. But there was nothing, only the dark outline of the pines swaying slightly in the wind. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every muscle tense, waiting for something to step out of the shadows. But after a long moment, the rustling stopped, the trees swayed, and the forest fell back into its unsettling quiet. I forced myself to sit back down, staring into the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the nerves from the night before. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike deeper into the woods. Maybe if I put some distance between myself and the campsite, I could clear my head. The trail was faint, barely more than a thin path winding through the trees. As I walked, I found more of the carvings on the trees, each one stranger than the last. They were everywhere. Slender, elongated figures with no faces, all staring outward, all watching. The forest felt darker here, the canopy thick enough that the sunlight barely broke through. About an hour in, I reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was stunning, endless trees stretching out below, the mountains rising in the distance. I was about to pull out my camera when I heard footsteps behind me. "Morning," a voice said. I turned to see an older man, probably in his 60s, standing a few feet away. He was holding a bundle of firewood in his arms, his face weathered and sun-creased like someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, giving him a nod. "Not many people come this deep into the forest," the man replied, his voice low and rough. He looked me up and down, then glanced toward the valley. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just over by the lake, trying to get some quiet." He gave me a long look, his expression unreadable. "You should be careful. This part of the Adirondacks, it's different." "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He glanced around, his eyes flicking nervously toward the trees. "There's something in these woods. People call it the Watcher. It stays deep in the forest, watching from the shadows. You see it once, and you'll start seeing it everywhere." I laughed, shaking my head. "Local ghost stories." The man didn't smile. "It's not a story. It's real. People who see the Watcher, they don't come back the same." He took a step closer. "I'm telling you this because you look like you've seen things. You know when something's not right and something's not right here." I met his gaze, feeling that familiar knot of unease tightening in my gut. "What do you mean?" "You'll know when it's close. You'll hear it first, and then you'll feel it." He turned, starting back down the trail. "Just don't stay too long." I watched him go, his words echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as superstition, but the way he'd looked at me, like he'd seen the same thing I had last night, made it hard to dismiss. That evening back at camp, the unease was worse. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees towering higher than I remembered, the shadows deeper, darker. The wind had picked up, making the fire flicker and sputter, but it didn't drown out the sounds. The rustling came back, louder this time, and with it, something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the darkness, but the beam barely seemed to penetrate the trees. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit them, but when I moved the beam, they started again. I stood, turning in a slow circle, the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My pulse was pounding, adrenaline kicking in. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone out here. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. And then, just beyond the firelight, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. Its body was almost skeletal, its limbs too long, and its head bent slightly as if it were watching me from above. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow, dark pits that stared right at me. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking despite myself. The figure didn't respond. It stayed still, silent, its form almost blending into the shadows. I raised my knife, backing toward the RV. The figure remained at the edge of the light, watching, waiting. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. For hours I sat by the window, knife in hand, waiting for the figure to move. But it never did. It just stood there, barely visible in the darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on the RV. At dawn, the figure was gone, but the carvings had multiplied, dozens of them surrounding the campsite. The same tall, thin figures etched into the trees like a silent army. I didn't waste time. I packed up everything, threw it into the RV, and started the engine. As I drove away, the carvings seemed to watch me, following me down the narrow trail, their hollow eyes staring. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the Adar, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as the trees thinned and the road stretched out in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Watcher was still out there, somewhere in those woods. It was still watching, and maybe it always would be. My name is Jack Bennett, and back in 2016, I decided to take my RV out to a quiet spot near the Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon. My wife was usually my camping partner, but she'd caught a bad flu, so I went solo. I figured I could manage a few nights alone, read a few books, and fish. My idea of the perfect downtime was no phone service, no one around, and a lake where the fish didn't mind biting. I parked the RV in a secluded spot right near a lake, and after a few hours of quiet, I felt my shoulders drop. The only sounds were the soft rush of the wind in the pines and the occasional splash in the water. I set up a few fishing lines on the edge of the lake and grabbed a beer from the cooler, sinking into my camping chair as the evening settled in. On the first night, I thought I heard something outside the RV around midnight, just a few crunches on the gravel, like someone was walking. I figured it was an animal, a deer maybe, though I still got up and looked outside, finding nothing, just shadows in the silent forest. I brushed it off. This wasn't my first solo camping trip, and I was used to hearing noises now and then. The second night, though, I heard it again. This time, the crunching was slower, deliberate, not the kind of sound an animal makes. I was lying in bed trying to read by flashlight, but the noise made me put down the book. I listened for a few moments, then quietly got up and out the small RV window. Standing near the edge of the clearing was a tall man. He was in his 50s, I'd guess, with gray hair and clothes that looked too clean for camping. He stood completely still, his face tilted up as if he was sniffing the air. It wasn't exactly the type of scene I expected to see on a solo camping trip, and my first thought was he was probably a ranger. I decided to step out and ask if he needed help. As I opened the door, he turned slowly toward me, and I noticed his lips twitching into what could have been a smile, or maybe a snarl. I felt my stomach tighten, but I ignored it. "Hey there," I called. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at me with this fixed, unnerving look, his lips parting a little like he was tasting the air. There was something off about him, but I tried to keep things normal. You camping out here too?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was scratchy like he hadn't used it in a long time. "Got lost," he muttered, his words almost a whisper. Been out here looking for a place to stay. I tried to keep my tone casual. Well, there's a town about 20 miles south. I could show you the way in the morning. His eyes shifted, and for a moment I thought he'd agree, but then he looked down at my fishing gear lying on the ground by the water. I haven't had fish in a long time, he said, his voice barely audible. It was then that I noticed his hands. They were covered in what looked like dried blood. My heart started to race, but I forced myself to stay calm. I have some food in the RV, I said, inching back toward the door. You're welcome to some if you're hungry. He took a step forward, still smiling that strange half-snarl of his. I don't eat canned food, he said, as if that settled things. I nodded slowly, my hand reaching for the door handle. All right then. Well, I'd best get some sleep. Before I could turn around, he took another step toward me, closer now, and his voice dropped to a raspy whisper. What are you doing out here alone, friend? There was something chilling in the way he said friend, as if it meant the opposite. I swallowed hard, keeping my voice steady. Just camping. I like the quiet. He tilted his head, examining me with a strange intensity. You're lying. My pulse hammered in my chest, but I forced a casual smile. No, I'm just a regular guy out for some peace and quiet. His eyes narrowed, and he took another slow step forward. I knew then I needed to get back inside, lock the door, and maybe even drive off if he kept pressing closer. All right, I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. You take care now. I turned, and that's when I heard him sprint forward. Instinct kicked in, and I threw myself into the RV, slamming the door just in time to hear his fist pounding against it. The door shook, the thin walls rattling as his voice grew louder, angrier. Let me in, friend, he screamed, his voice twisted with rage. You think you're safe in there? I scrambled back, locking myself in the small bathroom, listening as he tried the handle, then started circling the RV, tapping on each window, trying each latch. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, hoping he'd get bored or think better of it. But he didn't. For hours, he lingered outside, muttering to himself, his voice carrying words I couldn't quite make out. Occasionally, he'd laugh, a low, mirthless sound that sent chills down my spine. When I finally dared to peek out through a crack in the bathroom door, I saw his face inches from the window, his eyes scanning the inside of the RV as if he were hunting something or someone. Eventually, he moved back, retreating into the forest as the first light of dawn broke over the trees. I waited a full hour, my heart still hammering, before I worked up the nerve to unlock the door and step outside. I thought he was gone, but as I moved to collect my fishing gear, I found a makeshift camp hidden in the trees nearby, littered with rotting food, empty cans, and something else. Bones. Small bones. Some picked clean, others still covered in dried blood. When I looked closer, I saw something scrawled on a piece of bark near the edge of his camp. The words were carved in deep, jagged letters. One more to go. That was when I knew he hadn't just been lost. He'd been hunting, and that night, I'd been the one he'd chosen. I stumbled back from the trees, my eyes darting around the quiet, misty forest. Every crackle of a branch sounded too loud, too close. I grabbed my fishing rod, not even caring about the tackle box I'd left on the shore. I just needed to get out. I sprinted back to the RV, threw myself inside, and started the engine. The tires kicked up gravel as I tore out of the clearing. I could barely keep my hands steady on the wheel, gripping it so hard my knuckles went white. The forest blurred past me as I drove, trying to leave every trace of him behind. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road. It was only then that I let myself breathe, glancing over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't somehow trailing me. When I finally pulled into the nearest town, I parked outside a diner, its lights casting a soft glow in the early morning. I didn't care about looking disheveled or that I was the only customer there before dawn. I just wanted to be around people. The waitress took one look at me and brought over a cup of coffee without even asking. Rough night? She asked, eyeing the scrapes on my arms from where I'd bolted through the trees. I nodded, trying to steady myself enough to take a sip. You could say that, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me a moment, then leaned in, speaking quietly. You're not the first. There have been stories of strange folks around those woods, folks who don't belong, who are hunting something. I felt a chill as her words echoed what I'd seen. "What do you mean, hunting?" I asked, needing to hear someone else say it out loud. She lowered her voice even more. "People go missing now and then. They don't advertise it, of course, but I've lived here long enough to know what happens. They find remnants sometimes. A piece of clothing, a broken watch, a shoe. It's never much, and it's never enough to make sense of." I could feel my pulse quicken, the bones I'd seen, the mess at his camp. It hadn't been the camp of someone lost. He'd been out there a long time, gathering pieces, marking his territory. After she left, I sat in the diner for hours, watching cars pass and wondering how close I'd come to being his next. One more to go. Finally, I got up to leave, my legs shaky but ready to be anywhere but in that booth. I paid, thanked the waitress, and made my way back to the RV. Just before I climbed in, I noticed something out of place. A small, crumpled piece of bark wedged into my windshield wiper. My stomach twisted as I reached for it, turning it over in my hand. The words were scrawled in jagged letters, just like at his camp. Just like at his camp. "I know where you are." I left that town and never looked back. I had been driving for hours, the Mojave Desert stretching endlessly around me, barren and vast under the relentless sun. The road was long behind me now, just an empty trail of dust leading out to nowhere. Perfect. This was exactly what I needed. A break from work, from the grind, from people. Out here, there was nothing but silence and space. No cell towers, no deadlines, no distractions. Just me and the desert. I pulled the RV to a stop near a rocky outcrop and stepped out. The air was dry and still, the kind of quiet that felt like it was pressing down on you. I took a deep breath, inhaling the warm scent of sand and stone. This was my escape. No buzzing phone, no frantic emails, just the open sky and the endless horizon. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV in the shade of the rock formation and pulling out my gear. I wanted to explore before the light faded. There was something about the desert that always fascinated me, the way the landscape shifted from harsh to beautiful in a matter of hours. But right now, I was focused on one thing: silence. After weeks of being glued to my phone and running from meeting to meeting, the thought of being completely disconnected was a relief. No cell reception out here, no GPS signal, just me and the land. As I unpacked, I heard it, a faint sound, almost too soft to notice, a rhythmic beeping. At first, I thought it was something inside the RV, maybe an alarm or a piece of equipment malfunctioning. But after a quick check of my gear, everything seemed fine. The sound persisted though, steady and faint, like a pulse just beneath the surface. I stepped outside trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the desert was quiet. The only sound was the faint wind rustling through the rocks. I brushed it off, assuming it was some distant echo of the RV systems, and finished setting up camp. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, I felt that familiar sense of calm wash over me. This was why I came here, to escape, to let my mind breathe. But that night, the beeping came back. I was sitting by the campfire, watching the flames flicker against the darkening sky, when the sound returned, clearer this time. It was still faint, but persistent. A soft, rhythmic pulse, like something distant calling out. I stood, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily. Logic and reason were my tools, and they had served me well in the world of engineering. But there was something about the sound, something that felt wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire into the darkness. The desert stretched out before me, vast and empty. I started walking, following the faint sound. The rhythmic pulse grew louder as I moved away from the RV. For a while, I saw nothing but sand and rock. The beeping seemed to fade, then grow louder again, like it was moving with me, always just out of reach. I kept walking, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night, but every time I thought I was getting closer, the sound slipped away. Finally, I stopped. My pulse was racing now, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The beeping had faded again, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the desert. The silence around me was heavy, almost suffocating. I turned back toward the RV. The fire still glowed faintly in the distance as I walked. The beeping returned, faint but steady, like a distant heartbeat. The next morning, the sound was gone. The desert was still quiet, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Isolation could do that. The vast emptiness of the desert, the absence of any familiar sounds, it could mess with your head. I decided to hike further out, hoping to clear my mind. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, the sun already beating down on the sand. I grabbed my gear, making sure I had plenty of water, and started walking toward a rocky ridge I had spotted in the distance. Halfway there, I saw him, a man walking toward me from the opposite direction, his figure small against the endless desert. I hadn't expected to see anyone out here. This was a remote area, far off the beaten path. As the figure grew closer, I could make out an older man, his clothes worn and dusty, his face lined and weathered from the sun. "Hey," I called out, raising a hand as we approached each other. The man nodded, his eyes distant, almost vacant. "You camping out here alone?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, just me," I said, a little taken aback by his bluntness. "I've been walking for days," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You heard it yet? The signal?" I blinked, unsure if I had heard him right. "The signal?" He nodded, his expression grim. "You'll hear it. Once you hear it, you can't get it out of your head. I've been following it for days. It doesn't stop." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" The man glanced around nervously, as if the desert itself was listening. "There's something out here. Something that's been broadcasting for years. It gets inside your head. Starts with the beeping, then it gets louder. You'll see." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. He looked dehydrated, sunburned, like he'd been wandering the desert for days without rest. I offered him some water, but he shook his head and started walking again, heading back the way he came without another word. I stood there, watching him disappear into the distance, his words echoing in my mind. "Once you hear it, it doesn't stop." That night, the beeping was louder. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound pulsed through the silence, steady and rhythmic, like it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the sound was there, burrowing into my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, GPS, water, and set out into the desert. I had to find the source. I had to know what was causing the sound. The desert was pitch black, the sky filled with stars. My flashlight cut through the darkness, the beam dancing across the rocks and sand as I followed the beeping. It was louder now, almost frantic, like it was pulling me toward something. The GPS was acting strange, flickering in and out as if the signal was being disrupted. But I kept moving, my footsteps crunching in the sand. The beeping grew louder with every step. After what felt like hours, I saw it, a structure, half buried in the sand. A bunker or a weather station, long abandoned. The beeping was deafening now, emanating from somewhere inside. I hesitated, standing at the entrance of the bunker. The door was ajar, rusted and creaking in the wind. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to leave and forget about the sound. But I couldn't. The signal was pulling me in. I stepped inside. The air in the bunker was stale, suffocating. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the narrow corridor, the walls lined with rusted equipment and old faded maps. The beeping was louder now, echoing through the metal walls, vibrating in my chest. At the end of the corridor, I found a small room. In the center, there was an old radio tower, its equipment still faintly powered by some unknown source. But that wasn't what caught my attention. On the walls were symbols, strange, intricate markings that looked like they had been carved into the metal. They spiraled outward, converging on the radio tower as if they were feeding into it. In the corner of the room, I found a journal. Its pages were yellowed and brittle. The entries were short, scrawled in frantic handwriting. They talked about the signal, how it started with the beeping, how it got louder, how it never stopped. "It gets inside your head," one entry read. "It's not just a sound, it's alive." As I read, the beeping shifted, turning into a high-pitched screech that pierced through my skull. I dropped the journal, clutching my head as the sound rattled through my brain. It wasn't just a signal, it was something more. Something that had been waiting, broadcasting, pulling people in. I had to get out. I stumbled out of the bunker, the sound still ringing in my ears. The desert spun around me. I ran, my legs weak, my mind spinning. The landscape warped, the rocks and sand shifting as if the desert itself was alive, moving with the signal. When I finally made it back to the RV, I collapsed inside, my head pounding. The beeping was now a constant, dull hum in the back of my mind. I left the desert the next morning, driving as fast as I could. The beeping was still faint, but persistent. I didn't look back. Even now, days later, back in the city, I can still hear it. A faint, rhythmic pulse in the back of my mind. Always there. Always calling me back. The signal isn't done with me yet. My name's Dennis Sanders, and back in 2019, I was RV camping at Shenandoah National Park in Montana, just looking to escape for a while. I'd been juggling my job and family for as long as I could remember, and the weight of it was finally too much. So I thought, what better place than the Rockies to breathe some fresh air and recharge? I'd taken a month off to clear my head. Figured I'd sleep under the stars, fish in crystal lakes, and cook over an open flame, just like I'd always wanted to do. I had it all planned out. Every trail I wanted to hike, every fishing spot that promised trout as long as my arm, and a stack of firewood ready for quiet nights by the campfire. I'd driven up in my dad's old RV, the one he passed down to me last year after finally getting himself a newer model. That thing's a tank, a real beast that could go just about anywhere. I felt like a king steering it down the gravel road into the deep woods with no one around for miles. The closest person was probably 20 miles away in the nearest town. That was just how I liked it, alone. Everything was going smoothly for the first couple of days. I fished, I cooked, and I even managed to finish a couple of books. I was really settling into the quiet. And then, one night, things took a turn. I was sitting by the campfire, poking at the embers, half drunk on a bottle of whiskey and humming to myself when I heard footsteps. Heavy ones. Not the kind of rustling you hear from an animal. These were solid human steps. I went quiet and listened, figuring maybe it was just some hiker who'd lost his way. But then the footsteps stopped. Silence, just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Hello?" I called out, half wishing for an answer, but mostly hoping for none. "Who's there?" No response, just the crackle of the fire and the wind moving through the trees. I kept staring into the darkness, feeling something was definitely off. That's when I caught a faint glint, a reflection, maybe, something metallic just beyond the trees. It disappeared almost as soon as I noticed it. Figuring I'd had a little too much to drink, I shook it off and headed inside the RV. I figured if someone was really out there, they'd make themselves known. Besides, I had a pretty decent lock on the door. That night, I slept with one ear open, but nothing else happened. The next morning, though, things got weird. I woke up to find my fire pit scattered, logs tossed around as if someone had stomped through my camp, and a half-burnt stick lay right by my door, almost like someone had been waving it around, writing something in the ash. I thought maybe some local prankster had wandered in during the night, but this was way off the beaten path for that. Still, I shrugged it off, cleaned up the mess, and tried to enjoy my breakfast. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd look up from my book and scan the tree line, sure that I'd catch a glimpse of something moving, but every time, nothing. Just my nerves playing tricks, I figured. To distract myself, I went for a hike, hoping the exercise would clear my head. I must have hiked for hours, taking paths I hadn't planned to, just wandering aimlessly through the trees, feeling the vastness of the place settle over me. When I finally made it back to the RV, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. And that's when I saw it. Scrawled into the dust on my windshield in letters big enough that they couldn't be mistaken. "You shouldn't be here." It stopped me in my tracks. Someone had been here. Someone had gone up to my RV, close enough to leave a message. I looked around. The forest was silent and still. This wasn't funny anymore. I was shaken, no doubt about it. But I figured the best thing to do was play it cool, act like it didn't bother me. People around here probably got their kicks from scaring tourists. I wiped the windshield clean, checked my things, and didn't find anything missing. That night, though, I stayed inside the RV, armed with the heaviest flashlight I could find, just in case. I barely slept. Every little creak, every sigh of the wind had me on edge. Around midnight, I heard scratching. Faint at first, then louder, like someone running their fingers down the side of the RV. I froze, flashlight in hand, holding my breath as the sound moved from one end of the RV to the other. Then, silence. By dawn, I was half dead from exhaustion and fear. The scratching didn't come back. I figured it was time to cut my trip short. As much as I'd wanted the solitude, something was wrong here. My gut told me to leave. I started packing, throwing my stuff in haphazardly, just wanting to be gone. That's when I noticed something odd. The back tire on the RV was slashed, deep enough that I'd have no chance of driving on it. And there were footprints leading from the tire to the trees, as if someone had been waiting, watching. My heart sank. Then, from somewhere in the woods, I heard laughter. Low, barely audible, but unmistakable, a man's voice, gravelly and rough, echoing through the trees. I called out, demanding to know who was there, but only got more laughter in return. It was close, way too close for comfort. Realizing I couldn't stay, I decided to hike out to the main road. I wasn't about to sit around and wait for whoever this was to make their move. I packed my essentials, water, a knife, my flashlight, and locked the RV, hoping it would be safe until I got back. As I hiked, I kept my head down, moving as fast as I could without making too much noise. It was late afternoon by the time I got close to the main road. Relief flooded me. I'd made it. But just as I was about to step onto the road, I saw him. A man, tall and white, with a filthy jacket and long hair hanging in greasy strands, stood there, blocking the path. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow, and he was smiling. He held something in his hand, a knife. Long and wickedly sharp, the kind you'd use to skin an animal. He took a step toward me, that grin widening. "You're not leaving," he said, voice cold and even. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. We stood there locked in place until he lunged, swinging the knife. I barely dodged, stumbling backward into the underbrush. I grabbed a branch and swung, catching him in the arm. He grunted, but it didn't slow him down. He came at me again, slashing wildly. Desperation took over. I kicked, punched, did anything I could to keep him away. But he was strong, way stronger than he looked. He laughed. A horrible sound, like he was enjoying the fight. I managed to grab his wrist, twisting it until he dropped the knife. For a moment we were both unarmed, just two men in the middle of the woods, scrapping like animals. I threw a punch, hitting him square in the jaw, but he barely flinched. His hand shot out, grabbing me by the throat, squeezing until I couldn't breathe. My vision went blurry, spots dancing in front of my eyes. I clawed at his hand, but his grip was like iron. Then, with a final burst of strength, I jammed my knee into his stomach. He loosened his grip just enough for me to wrench free and scramble for the knife. I grabbed it, turned, and saw him charging at me again, that same twisted grin on his face. I swung the blade, catching him across the chest. He staggered back, clutching the wound, his face twisted in rage. For a second, I thought he was going to keep coming, but he collapsed to his knees, gasping, and fell to the ground, motionless. I didn't wait to check if he was dead. I bolted for the road, not stopping until I'd flagged down a passing car. I told the driver everything in a rush, my words tumbling out, barely making sense. They called the cops, and within hours the place was swarming with officers, combing the woods, taking my statement. They found my RV in the scene of the fight, and they found him, lying there just as I had left him, with a history that chilled me to the bone. His name was Warren Lair, a drifter with a long record of assault and battery, rumored to have been involved in a string of murders across state lines, all in remote camping sites like mine. They didn't say much about his background, just that he had a thing for terrorizing people who thought they were alone in the wild. Apparently, he'd been lurking around the park for weeks, watching campers, waiting for someone like me, someone isolated with no one around to hear them scream. My name is Adam Patterson, and this whole mess went down back in 2010 in the middle of nowhere, Yellowstone National Park. To give you some context, I wasn't the outdoorsy type. I'm from flat, humid Houston and had never even slept outside of my house, let alone in the wilderness. But my buddy Rick, who thought it would be hilarious to see me squirm, convinced me that a week in the wilds would toughen me up. He'd always been the adrenaline junkie in our friend group. Anyway, we drove up, loaded our backpacks with gear, and set off, ready to hike Yellowstone's remote thoroughfare trail, known for being one of the most isolated trails in the country. Yellowstone in the fall is a mixed bag of beauty and menace. The trees were aflame with autumn reds and oranges, and at the same time there was this chilling, eerie silence, like even the animals were holding their breath. The trail stretched for miles, winding through thick forest and across rivers with no cell service, no amenities, and certainly no backup plan. As the first few days passed, we got used to the silence, even joked about how this was peak manliness. But on the third night, things took a strange turn. We were camped near a narrow valley, a perfect spot, or so Rick had claimed. He was the one setting up our gear while I fumbled with my backpack, cursing the weight and itching to drop it. That's when we noticed the first sign that something was off. A low, distant rumble came from somewhere down the valley. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't the wind. We shrugged it off as a rock slide or an echo, something that couldn't hurt us. But later that night, after we'd finally settled into our tents, we heard it again, closer this time. Rick, ever the brave one, decided it was worth investigating. I rolled my eyes, thinking he was just looking for any excuse to spook me. We lit a couple of flashlights and crept down the valley, scanning the trees and rocks. The noise was sporadic, shifting in location as if it was circling us. Suddenly, we heard a loud crunch, like bones snapping. Our flashlights darted over to a twisted tree stump, and there, half buried in the brush, was the carcass of a deer. It was fresh, with a gaping wound across its torso, and yet there was something horribly wrong with it. The ribcage looked almost crushed, like it had been hit with a sledgehammer, or something stronger than any bear or wolf I'd ever heard of. We glanced at each other, trying to find a logical explanation. Rick muttered something about a freak accident and laughed it off, but I could see that even he was rattled. That night, I barely slept, and from the sounds of it, neither did Rick. We kept hearing that crunching noise echo through the trees. When morning finally came, I was ready to pack up and head back to the car. But Rick insisted. We'd come this far and couldn't back out over some noises and a dead animal. He didn't have to say it twice. Pride wouldn't let me be the one to chicken out first. Day 4 was rough. The farther we trekked, the darker the sky became. By noon, clouds were rolling in thick and heavy, and before long, we were trudging through a downpour. Everything was soaked, and the trail had turned to mud, making each step harder. The rain slowed us down, and by the time we set up camp, it was nearly pitch black. Rick started a fire to dry our gear, and we huddled around it, miserable but trying to keep our spirits up. That's when we heard it again, closer than ever. The crunching. But this time, there was another sound, something wet and heavy dragging along the ground. I couldn't help but think about the deer, torn open and discarded like a half-eaten meal. I whispered to Rick, asking if he thought it might be a bear. He gave me a look, one I hadn't seen before. "Bears don't leave wounds like that," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Besides, a bear wouldn't follow us like this." Then, just beyond the reach of the firelight, we saw something move. Not a bear, not a wolf, but something hunched and massive, crouching low to the ground. Its limbs looked wrong. Too long, too thin, and the way it moved reminded me of an overgrown dog with a broken spine. It was sniffing the ground, moving its head slowly from side to side like it was tasting the air, inching closer to the fire. I could smell it, that rancid metallic stench, like copper and rot. Rick had gone pale, his eyes locked on the thing. He slowly reached for his knife, but I could see his hand was shaking. I barely breathed, watching as the creature circled our camp, making a wide, deliberate arc, almost as if it was sizing us up. Then it stopped. It lifted its head, and though I couldn't see its face clearly, I could make out jagged patches of fur and something shiny and black on its face, dripping. Rick whispered for me to stay calm, but my heart was pounding so hard I thought it'd leap right out of my chest. And then it charged. Rick shouted, leaping in front of me with his knife outstretched, but the thing swatted him aside like he was nothing. I watched him hit the ground, motionless, and all I could think was that I needed to run. I scrambled up, tripping over roots and rocks, tearing through the trees blindly. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, its breathing heavy and ragged. The adrenaline was blinding. I couldn't see where I was going. I just kept running. I didn't stop until I was knee-deep in a freezing river. I looked around breathless and couldn't see it anymore. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, waiting for any sign of that thing. Eventually, when the first light of dawn broke, I forced myself out of the water and stumbled back to where I thought Rick would be. When I got there, the fire was smoldering, and Rick was nowhere in sight. All that was left was his knife, slick with something dark. I didn't want to think about it, but I knew he wasn't coming back. Not like that. I forced myself to start walking, barely able to breathe, following the trail back in the general direction of our car. The whole way I kept hearing it, just on the edge of the forest, those same heavy, dragging steps shadowing me. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the parking lot through the trees. I didn't look back, didn't slow down, just kept going until I practically fell into my car. I locked the doors, started the engine, and sped out of there without a second glance. When I reported Rick missing, the rangers didn't find a trace. No sign of him. No trace of the campsite. They found the carcass of a mangled deer and tried to pass it off as a bear attack, but I knew better. Whatever was out there in those woods wasn't any bear, wolf, or mountain lion. A month later, I went back to the ranger station, thinking maybe I'd get closure, maybe someone had found something. The ranger on duty, an older guy with a grim look, took me aside. He told me stories about strange sightings in the thoroughfare. Rumors passed down from one generation to the next. Stories of an old mutated predator, something that evolved out there undisturbed for centuries. He said some of the locals believed it was a curse of the land, a punishment on those who tried to claim territory that wasn't theirs. I left Yellowstone that day, and I never looked back. Whatever that thing was, it was real. And it was out there, roaming those woods, patient, calculating. In the end, they never found Rick's body, just a torn boot and a half-buried knife left to rust in the dark earth. My name is Nathan Matthews, and I'm 43 years old. This happened just last November, though sometimes it feels like a dream, a fevered, impossible nightmare. But I know it wasn't. The evidence is still on my hard drive, and the memories refuse to fade. I was on a solo trip to Wilson's Creek National Battlefield near Republic, Missouri. As an amateur documentarian and history enthusiast, I had been traveling in my RV for months, recording footage for a series about haunted Civil War sites. Wilson's Creek was next on my list, known for its brutal battle in 1861 and the ghost stories that lingered. People claimed to hear phantom cannon fire, see soldiers in the fog, and even witness the Ray House transform into the bustling field hospital it once was. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the stories intrigued me. Besides, documenting them made for good content. That's all this was supposed to be. A project, something to keep my mind busy after my wife Claire passed away. I pulled into the parking lot of the Wilson's Creek Visitor Center mid-afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the fields. The park was quiet, eerily so. For a place of such historical significance, I'd expected other visitors, but I seemed to have the battlefield to myself. Inside the visitor center, I met Betty, a sprightly older woman who offered to guide me through the park. Her knowledge was impressive, rattling off battle strategies and casualty numbers like they were yesterday's news. But when I asked her about the hauntings, her tone shifted. "People see things," she said cryptically. "Hear things, especially at night." "What kind of things?" I pressed, angling my phone's voice recorder closer. Betty pursed her lips. "Soldiers, mostly. Lost souls. Some say the battlefield replays itself like a broken record. I'd stay away after dark if I were you." I smiled politely but dismissed her warning. Ghosts weren't real. History was. That evening, I parked my RV in a designated camping area not far from the Ray House. The house was a stark white structure, quiet and unassuming in the fading light. It was hard to imagine it had once been a bloody field hospital. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the park transformed. The peaceful stillness of the day gave way to something heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. I set up my equipment, tripods, cameras, audio recorders, near the Ray House. Around midnight, I reviewed the first round of footage in the RV. My heart skipped a beat when I heard faint, muffled cries on the audio track. They sounded like men shouting orders, followed by a sharp crack that could have been a musket. But when I checked the video, the field was empty. No movement, no source. The next morning, I met Ethan, a park ranger, as I hiked back toward the Ray house. He was young, but carried himself like someone who'd seen more than he let on. "You're the guy camping out here, huh?" he asked, adjusting his hat. "Yeah, working on a documentary," I replied, pointing to my camera gear. Ethan hesitated, then said, "Be careful out there. You might not believe the stories, but this place has a way of getting to people." "What do you mean?" he shrugged. "Some folks see things they can't explain. A couple of tourists last year left in the middle of the night, said they heard someone walking around their tent, but no one was there." I nodded, though I didn't take him seriously. Ghost stories were great for tourism, but I needed hard evidence. That afternoon, I ventured deeper into the battlefield. The fields stretched out endlessly, dotted with weathered cannons and plaques marking key moments in the battle. I took some stunning shots of the landscape, but my focus was on the Ray house. As I approached, I noticed something strange. Bits of old fabric and rusted tools scattered near the house. They looked like bandages and surgical instruments, but how could they still be here after more than a century? I reached for my camera, but a faint groan stopped me cold. It sounded human, but when I spun around, the field was empty. That night, the battlefield came alive. I was filming the moonlit fields when I saw it, a flickering light in the distance. It looked like a campfire, but it hadn't been there during the day. As I walked toward it, the air grew colder. My breath misted in front of me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then I saw them. Shadowy figures moved through the fog. At first, they were faint outlines, but as I got closer, they sharpened into the forms of soldiers. Some marched in formation, rifles in hand. Others slumped over, clutching wounds. Their faces were pale and blurred, like watercolors bleeding into paper. I froze, my camera dangling uselessly from my neck. They didn't notice me. Or if they did, they didn't care. They were trapped in their own endless battle, repeating the same moments over and over. I stumbled back to the RV, but the activity didn't stop. As I fumbled with the door, a deafening blast echoed through the night. It was unmistakably cannon fire. Inside, the RV felt like a cage. The walls shook and the lights flickered. I heard voices outside, men shouting orders, horses neighing, the clash of metal on metal. But when I peered through the window, the battlefield was empty. The sounds grew louder, unbearable. Then came the knocking. A single deliberate knock on the RV door. I didn't answer. Another knock. Then another, more insistent. Finally, I swung the door open, flashlight in hand. No one was there. But as the beam swept across the ground, I saw fresh footprints in the mud. Boot prints leading away from the RV and disappearing into the field. I couldn't stay another night. I packed up my equipment and tried to start the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. I cursed and grabbed my phone, only to find it wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing. Desperate, I started walking toward the visitor center. The battlefield was pitch black, and the fog seemed thicker than before. As I stumbled through the fields, I heard it again. My name, whispered from somewhere in the fog. "Nathan?" I didn't look back. By the time I reached the visitor center, the sun was rising. Betty was there, opening up for the day. I tried to explain what had happened, but she just smiled sadly. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. Betty leaned closer. "They're not done fighting. They never will be." I left Wilson's Creek that morning, swearing never to return, but the footage I captured tells a different story. In every frame just behind me is a shadowy figure, a soldier watching, waiting. Some battles never end. The road wound through the dense trees, snaking deeper into the heart of the low national forest. The thick canopy above allowed only sparse sunlight to filter through, casting shadows across the narrow dirt road. I gripped the steering wheel of my RV, trying to shake off the gnawing sense of unease creeping up my spine. It had been 3 hours since I'd passed another vehicle. Solitude was the whole point, wasn't it? This trip was supposed to help me clear my head, to reconnect with myself after the divorce. I had spent the last few months in a fog, and this trip to Deadwood Creek was meant to be my escape, a test of independence. No ex-husband, no stress, just me in the wilderness. I needed this, at least. That's what I'd been telling myself for the past 2 weeks. Deadwood Creek Campground wasn't listed on any mainstream maps, just a blip on an obscure site for hardcore campers who sought isolation. The campground had a reputation, but that was part of the appeal. I needed remote quiet, far away from anything that reminded me of what I'd left behind. But as I pulled into the clearing, past the sign half buried in moss that read, Deadwood Creek, a shiver ran through me. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you second-guess your decision to be alone. I parked the RV near a small trickling creek. The only other vehicle was an old, beat-up camper a short distance away, nestled under the towering pines. It was empty. No sign of movement, no campfire. Good. I wasn't in the mood for socializing. I stepped out into the cool afternoon air and surveyed the site. The woods were thick, ancient. The ground was littered with pine needles, muffling the sound of my footsteps. A perfect retreat. I set up camp, unfolding my chair and setting my mug of tea beside me as I sat by the creek, listening to the soft gurgle of the water. It was peaceful, just as I'd hoped. But after a while, the peace felt off. Too still. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, and the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive. My mind wandered back to the stories I'd read online, the rumors about Deadwood Creek's dark history. This used to be a mining settlement during the gold rush, or so the tale went. Dozens of men had come to find their fortunes, but most found only death. Mysterious disappearances, bodies never recovered. Some say the men still haunt the place, bound to the land, working their endless shifts beneath the earth. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to local folklore meant to spook tourists. But now, sitting alone in the fading light, the stories didn't seem so far-fetched. The wind rustled the trees, and I jumped at the sound. Get it together, Hannah, I thought, rolling my eyes at my own nerves. I hadn't come all this way just to scare myself into leaving. That's when I saw him, a man standing near the edge of the campground, just at the tree line, leaning against a tree. He was tall with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard, his clothes worn and dirty as if he'd been out here for weeks. His gaze was fixed on me. I waved awkwardly and he lifted a hand in response before slowly walking over. Didn't mean to spook you, he said, his voice easy, almost too casual. Didn't expect anyone else out here this late in the season. I wasn't expecting anyone either, I replied, forcing a smile. Just needed some time alone, you know? Yeah, I get that, he chuckled, though the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm Rick, by the way. Been coming here for years. I nodded, unsure what to say. Rick had the look of someone who belonged out here, who knew the woods like the back of his hand. I didn't. Be careful out here, Rick said after a pause, his gaze drifting toward the woods. Deadwood Creek's got a history. Strange things happen when the sun goes down. My skin prickled at his words, but I forced myself to laugh. Let me guess. Ghost stories? Miners and all that? Rick's expression didn't change. Something like that. Just don't stray too far from your camp. He turned and walked back to his camper without another word, leaving me with a knot of unease in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. The RV was quiet, the temperature inside dropping faster than I expected. I wrapped myself in blankets and tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Then, the sound started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but soon I realized it was more than that. Faint at first, barely perceptible. A rhythmic clinking echoed from the direction of the creek. It sounded like tools. Mining tools. Pickaxes striking rock. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. No, I was just imagining it. This was what I came here for. Solitude. But I couldn't shake the sound. It was getting louder, the metallic rhythm persistent, almost like a heartbeat. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed out of the RV, my breath visible in the cold night air. The forest was a wall of darkness, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The sound of the creek was louder now, rushing over rocks, and I could swear I heard voices, whispers carried on the wind. My flashlight beam swept across the campsite, catching nothing but trees and the faint shimmer of water. But then I saw them, figures, shadowy, half-formed shapes moving by the creek, their outlines faint but unmistakably human. They moved like they were working, digging, swinging pickaxes in time with the clinking sound. My throat tightened as I realized they weren't there in the normal sense. They were translucent, faded. I stumbled back, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. Ghosts? No, that was impossible. I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing, but as I turned, I nearly collided with Rick. Easy, he said, raising his hands. I saw your light. Thought I'd come check on you. I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd just seen, but Rick didn't need me to. He just looked over at the creek and nodded, his face unreadable. They come out at night, the miners. Been here for over a century, trapped in their own hell. I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic. You mean you know about this? What is this place? Rick gave a half smile, though it was more sad than comforting. Deadwood Creek. These men came here to find gold, but all they found was death. Now they're stuck here, working the land forever. Some nights they're just echoes, other nights. He trailed off, but the implication was clear. On other nights, they weren't just echoes. My name is Adam Patterson, and back in 2020, I took my old RV out to the quiet forested edges of North Cascades National Park in Washington State. It was my first real solo camping trip, and I'd been waiting for something like this, a solid getaway from my usual routine back in Seattle. I wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type, but I figured why not? I'd bought the RV on a whim the year before, a retirement gift to myself, though retired might have been stretching it. Let's just say my company wasn't thrilled when I walked out that morning. The mist hung low over the ground, and the air was as crisp as it gets. It felt good to breathe that air without the usual city grime. I settled into my folding chair with a paperback, expecting nothing more from the day than some peace. My plan was simple: sit around, maybe fish a little, grill up whatever was in the freezer, then call it a night. Easy, right? I hadn't noticed anyone else on my stretch of road. That was one of the things I liked about the park. Vast, quiet, and empty. No tourists, no loud music, and most importantly, no nosy neighbors. I'd parked in a remote area with views of towering Douglas firs and thick ferns carpeting the ground, somewhere off Route 20 where most folks don't bother going. I'd barely been there half a day when I heard a distant crunch of footsteps. Looking up, I spotted a man in the distance, cutting through the trees like he owned the place. He was tall, lean but wiry, with a face that looked as though it had taken a few hits over the years. His dark, greasy hair was shoved under a beat-up baseball cap, and his clothes looked worn, like they'd seen more forest nights than washing machines. He caught my eye, and for a second, I thought he was going to keep walking. But instead, he stopped, gave me a look that lingered just a little too long, then veered off toward my RV. I put down my book and stood up, trying to look casual but still assertive, like maybe he'd get the hint that this was private space. Not that I had any ownership over the forest, but it's natural to feel territorial when you're alone in the woods. "Nice setup you got here," he said in a voice that was rough and gravelly, almost like he hadn't spoken in a while. "Didn't expect anyone out this far." I shrugged, keeping my tone light. "Just me. Figured I'd get some quiet out here." He didn't respond right away, just let his eyes drift over my RV, my cooler, the small stack of firewood I'd gathered. Then he nodded. "You mind if I sit?" I did mind, actually, but I didn't want to come off as rude, so I forced a nod. He plopped down on the edge of the picnic table, eyes still scanning my stuff. "You been out here long?" he asked. "Just got here this morning," I replied, not offering much. "Ah," he said, scratching at his neck. "I've been out here a while myself, been walking a lot." Pretty remote place for a hike, I noted, trying to gauge his intentions. His clothes had stains that weren't exactly mud, and his fingernails were caked with something darker. I was already regretting letting him sit. "You ever hear the stories about this place?" he asked, his voice low. "People go missing in these woods." That line would have felt more ominous if it hadn't sounded like the setup for a ghost story. I smirked, leaning back. "Well, I haven't seen any ghosts yet." His expression didn't change. "Not ghosts," he replied slowly. "People." A pause settled over us, thick and awkward. I'd had enough weird encounters back in the city, but something about his presence, the way his eyes bored into mine with a strange intensity, made me uneasy. I cleared my throat, glancing around. "Well, I think I'll head back to my chair. Got some reading to catch up on." "Sure," he said, not moving. "Just be careful, yeah?" With that, he wandered off, not saying another word. I watched him go until he disappeared into the trees and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Something about him was off, but I tried to brush it off as paranoia. I wasn't used to being alone in the woods, after all. Maybe I was just reading too much into things. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little noise, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, made me sit up and look around. I saw nothing though, and after a few hours I managed to convince myself it was all in my head. That night I set up a small fire by the RV and tried to relax, but as darkness settled in, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, amplifying every little sound. I could hear my own breathing, the crackling of the fire, the occasional hoot of an owl. But somewhere in the distance I thought I heard footsteps, slow, steady, and unmistakably human. I froze, straining my ears to listen, but the footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they'd started. I waited, muscles tense, eyes scanning the tree line, but I saw nothing. It was probably an animal, I told myself, though I didn't entirely believe it. After a while, I went back into the RV, locking the door behind me. I'd left a window cracked for some air, and as I settled into bed, I tried to put it out of my mind. I was dozing off when I heard it again, a faint rustling followed by a low creak that sounded like footsteps outside. Heart pounding, I sat up and grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on. I scanned the inside of the RV, then peered out the window. Nothing, just darkness and the quiet shapes of trees swaying in the breeze. I started to turn away when something moved just at the edge of the light. The man from earlier stood there, his face blank, his eyes fixed on the RV. He didn't move, just stood there, staring. It wasn't until I saw the glint of something in his hand that I realized he was holding a knife. I dropped the flashlight, my breath hitching. I was trapped in here, miles from anyone who could help. Grabbing my cell phone, I frantically dialed, only to see no service flashing on the screen. Typical. The next few minutes were a blur. I grabbed a metal pipe I'd brought for setting up the awning and inched toward the door. My mind raced through options, each one more useless than the last. He was still outside, pacing now, like he was trying to work himself up to something. I needed a distraction. In a split-second decision, I cracked open the window just enough to toss out an empty beer can I'd left by the sink. It hit the ground with a soft clank and his head whipped toward the noise. Seizing the moment, I flung open the RV door, lunged out, and swung the pipe as hard as I could. The metal hit his shoulder, and he stumbled back, dropping the knife. I didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. I took off running, my legs burning as I bolted through the trees. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping me going, but I could still hear him behind me, stumbling through the brush, cursing under his breath. I kept running, every instinct telling me not to look back, not to stop. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, my heart hammering. I was alone, bruised and shaken, but alive. In the days that followed, I learned that authorities had found traces of what the man had done, shallow graves scattered around the woods with remains too far gone to identify. They said he'd been hiding out in the park for years, living off the grid, hunting the occasional unsuspecting camper. But when I think back to that night, the thing that haunts me isn't the chase or even the terror I felt. It's the thought of how close I'd come to being just another name on a missing persons list. Another story lost in the depths of the forest. I never wanted to drive Loveland Pass again. I hadn't been back on that stretch of road since the night Marty died. The night his rig went over the edge and disappeared into the fog like it had never existed. The only thing they found was twisted metal at the bottom of the canyon. I told myself it wasn't my fault, but the guilt stuck to me like oil on a rag, refusing to wash off no matter how many miles I put between me and that place. But Pete called in a favor. He needed me, and I owed him more than I could count. A convoy job through the Rockies, 3 trucks hauling high-value cargo to a research facility in Colorado. It was big money, but more than that, it was for Pete. He convinced me with a laugh over the phone. "Come on, Red, we need your experience out here." What could go wrong? I didn't laugh, not this time. So there I was, back in the driver's seat of my rig, with Pete leading the convoy and another trucker, Jerry, bringing up the rear. The snow-capped peaks of the Rockies loomed ahead as we started our ascent through Loveland Pass. The winding road snaked around the mountains, a narrow, dangerous route where one wrong move could send you tumbling into nothingness. The The memories hit hard as soon as we passed the first switchback, the same stretch where Marty had lost control. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the familiar weight of regret in my chest. I'd spent years avoiding convoys, always driving solo. The ghosts from that night hadn't let me forget, and now I was back, like I was inviting them to haunt me all over again. "Red, you still with us?" Pete's voice crackled over the CB, cutting through my thoughts. I pressed the mic. "Yeah, still here. Roads are getting slick. We should take it slow." Pete agreed, and we settled into the grind, navigating the treacherous turns with caution. The sun had set hours ago, and now only the thin beams of our headlights cut through the growing darkness. The fog rolled in thick and fast, curling around the edges of the road like ghostly fingers. That's when I saw it up ahead. Just barely visible through the fog was a pair of headlights. They flickered like a dying flame, appearing and disappearing in the swirling mist. I squinted, leaning forward, trying to get a better look. It was a truck, no doubt about it, but there was something familiar about the way it moved, the way it hugged the curves of the road like it had been driving this route for years. I keyed the mic again. "Pete, you see that truck up ahead?" Silence. Then Pete's voice came through, confused. "There's no truck, Red, just us." I glanced in the mirror. Jerry's headlights were still behind me, steady and unchanging. But the truck in front? It wasn't one of ours. I let go of the mic, my gut tightening. Maybe it was a local driver, someone familiar with the area. But as I watched it more closely, I knew that wasn't right. The truck was old, real old, the kind of rig you didn't see much on the road anymore. And then it hit me, hard and fast. The paint job, the faded red stripe down the side, the same color as the one Marty had on his rig. My chest tightened. "No?" I whispered, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. It couldn't be Marty's truck. It was gone, destroyed, crumpled at the bottom of a canyon. But this was his rig. It had to be. The headlights flickered again, and then the truck was gone, swallowed by the fog like it had never been there. "Red, you good back there?" Pete's voice crackled through again. I didn't respond right away. My pulse was racing, my hands slick with sweat. I glanced around, looking for any sign of the truck, but the road was empty. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice shaky. "Just seeing things." But I wasn't seeing things, not this time. We kept moving, the road winding higher, the fog thickening. The curves grew sharper, and the guardrails seemed to disappear into the mist, making it feel like we were driving on the edge of the world. That's when the CB crackled again. But this time, it wasn't Pete or Jerry's voice. "Red, you gotta help me." The voice was faint, distorted, but I recognized it immediately. My heart stopped. "Marty?" I whispered, disbelief creeping into my voice. The radio stayed silent for a moment, but then it came again, clearer this time, like the words were being dragged through the static. "Red, help me. I can't hold on." I dropped the mic. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Marty was dead, gone, but that voice, it was his. Down to the rasp he always had when he called me Red. I hadn't heard it in years, and yet here it was, crackling through the radio like a ghost from the past. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was just some weird interference. But the road ahead seemed to twist and shift unnaturally, like the mountains themselves were trying to trap us in. I checked my mirrors again, half expecting to see the ghost truck reappear. But there was nothing, just the thick, swirling fog. "Pete, something's not right," I said into the mic, trying to keep my voice steady. "We should stop, let the fog clear." "Negative, Red. We've got a tight schedule. Keep moving." His response was sharp, almost panicked. Pete wasn't the type to scare easily, but I could hear the tension in his voice. He knew something was wrong too, but he didn't want to say it. The fog pressed in closer, and suddenly, the road didn't feel familiar anymore. I'd driven this pass more times than I could count, but now it was like the route had changed. The turns were sharper, the drops steeper. I didn't know where we were headed anymore. And then I saw the truck again. It appeared out of the fog, closer this time, swerving wildly across the road. The old rusted cab, the faded red stripe. It was Marty's rig, no doubt about it. But when I pulled alongside, there was no driver. The cab was empty, the windows fogged over from the inside. My stomach lurched. I slammed the brakes, swerving to avoid the ghost truck, but it vanished into the mist as quickly as it had come. My truck fishtailed, tires screeching against the wet pavement, but I managed to hold it steady. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Red, what the hell's going on back there?" Pete's voice snapped through the radio. "I saw him," I muttered, barely able to catch my breath. "I saw Marty's truck." Silence hung in the air for a long moment. I knew Pete was processing what I'd said, trying to figure out if I was losing it or if there was something more. But before he could respond, the CB crackled again. Marty didn't make it. It wasn't Pete. It wasn't Jerry. It was Marty. His voice filled the cab clearer than before, as if he was sitting right next to me. "You let me go, Red. You let me fall." I clenched the wheel, anger and fear boiling in my chest. "I didn't let you fall. I tried, Marty. You didn't try hard enough." The road twisted again, sharper this time, and I could barely see the guardrail through the fog. But I kept driving, adrenaline coursing through me as Marty's voice echoed in my head. Suddenly, Pete's voice cut through the chaos. "Red, you gotta snap out of it. This isn't real." "It's the mountains messing with you," I snapped back. "Messing with me." "Don't act like you don't hear him, Pete." Pete didn't answer. The road ahead dipped sharply, and I saw it. The same curve where Marty had gone over. The same stretch of road where his truck had disappeared into the canyon. My heart raced, my mind spinning. Was that where this was leading? Was I about to relive Marty's crash? "Marty, I'm sorry," I whispered, gripping the wheel tighter as the road curved dangerously toward the edge. "I'm so damn sorry." The fog lifted just enough for me to see what was ahead. Marty's truck in the middle of the road blocking the pass. There was no time to stop. No time to think. I swerved hard, avoiding the ghost truck at the last second. My rig skidded, the wheels screeching as I fought to keep control. For a moment, I thought I was going over the edge. The wheels teetered on the lip of the canyon, the guardrail creaking under the weight of the truck. But I yanked the wheel, pulling the rig back onto solid ground. My breath came in ragged gasps. I looked in the rearview mirror. The ghost truck was gone. The fog was clearing, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. "Red?" Pete's voice came over the radio, softer now. "You still with us?" "Yeah," I whispered, gripping the wheel with trembling hands. "I'm still here." The mountains stretched ahead, empty and quiet. But I could still hear Marty's voice in the back of my mind, and I knew in some way he'd always be with me. We made it through the pass just as the sun broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the jagged peaks. The road ahead was clear, but I knew I'd never forget the night I'd faced Marty's ghost. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, immersed in the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life, birds, insects, something, but the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walked over to the RV, and ducked inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment. Then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing. I was sure of it, but the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone, it was for me. I shut the radio off, my fingers were trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods. The towering pines loomed overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years, to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weather jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. "I heard it too," he said. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal, the numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer, his voice low. "I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working, my cell phone drained to 0 in minutes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals, glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7, 8. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes constantly scanned the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "You think it's some kind of broadcast?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. "I don't think it's a broadcast at all." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I think it's a warning, or a signal from something out there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "A warning from what?" Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. And then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. "We see you." My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. "We see you." I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. "I think we should leave," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles. The battery drained faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 137. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. An old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small, glowing device pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once, an unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, like something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but the lights followed me, the clicking never far behind, but I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now and I'm still hearing them. 137. I can't get them out of my head. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am. And it's not done with me yet. The winding back roads of Kentucky had always been remote, a stretch of deep valleys and towering trees that twisted through land forgotten by time. This is where I'd set my camper up for the night, figuring it would be a peaceful rest stop. It was 1994. My name's Hank Lell, by the way, and I've lived a solid 50 years with enough bad habits to fill a book. Never imagined a camping trip would bring me the wildest chapter of them all. I'm not what you'd call a nature guy, but after a string of bad dates and a nagging brother who kept telling me to get out of my own head, I figured a weekend alone in the woods might do the trick. As I parked my RV, the silence settled heavy. There wasn't another person for miles. Or so I thought. I poured a stiff drink, leaned back in my lawn chair, and listened to the sound of crickets echoing through the hollow, watching the shadows grow thicker as dusk turned to night. The plan was simple. Just sit out here, have a few drinks, maybe roast a marshmallow or two, then get some sleep. Nothing complicated, nothing like what was coming. Just after midnight, I heard a rustle, not like the wind through the leaves. This was different, heavier, deliberate. I brushed it off at first, but the crunching and snapping of twigs grew closer, louder, almost like someone was circling my RV. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it around, casting the beam across the trees. Nothing. Just dense woods stretching out in every direction. Figuring it was some kind of wildlife, I shut off the light, muttering to myself that I was too jumpy for my own good. But as soon as the light went out, the rustling started again. Closer this time, circling like a predator closing in on prey. Then I saw him. A shadow slipped between the trees, barely visible in the dim moonlight, but it was enough to send every alarm in my body ringing. He stepped into view, and I'll be damned if he didn't look like he just crawled out of a horror flick. His clothes were shredded, a grimy flannel shirt hanging off his frame, his skin caked in what looked like mud, or worse. The man's face was expressionless, blank as a stone wall. He didn't blink or shift his weight like a normal person would, just stood there, half hidden in the shadows, his eyes locked on my camper, with a look that chilled me deeper than the night air. I hollered at him, tried to sound tougher than I felt. "You lost, buddy? Need some help?" He didn't answer, didn't move, just kept staring. After a minute, he took a step forward, his hand reaching into his pocket. I heard a metallic click that echoed through the silence like a gunshot, and it didn't take much to figure out what he was holding. Instincts kicked in. I dove back into the camper, slamming the door shut, fumbling with the lock. My heart hammered like a jackrabbit caught in a trap as I leaned against the door, listening. Silence. And then a low scraping sound. Metal on metal. He was dragging something along the side of the camper. I grabbed the biggest knife I had, some beat-up old hunting blade that I wasn't sure would even hold an edge. Every muscle in me was locked tight as I forced myself to breathe, to listen, to prepare. The scraping stopped, replaced by the slow, creaking sound of the camper door handle turning. A loud thump sounded as he tried the door again, harder this time. The lock held, but I knew it wouldn't for long. My eyes darted around the camper looking for anything I could use, anything that could give me a shot if he managed to break in. That's when I remembered the flare gun in the emergency kit by the door. Not exactly meant for close combat, but it was all I had. I stood there clutching that flare gun, the cold handle pressing into my palm, my fingers trembling despite my best efforts. The man outside let out a strange, high-pitched laugh, a sound that was half amusement, half madness, and then silence. The seconds dragged by, each one stretching out longer than the last. I almost thought he'd given up. Almost. Suddenly, a loud crash rattled the camper, nearly knocking me off my feet. The window beside the door shattered, glass spraying across the floor like a rain of ice. I raised the flare gun, pointing it at the broken window, my finger hovering over the trigger. His face appeared in the opening, grinning in a way that made my skin crawl. He had this look, like he was savoring the fear, feeding on it. His hand reached through the broken window, grasping for the door handle from the inside. Without thinking, I fired. The flare shot out in a burst of light, striking him square in the chest. He screamed, a sound so raw and wild it cut through the night, echoing through the trees as he stumbled back, clawing at the flare embedded in his shirt. I didn't wait to see if he'd stay down. I grabbed my keys, shoved them into the ignition, and floored it. The camper roared to life, lurching forward as I tore down the narrow road, barely keeping it steady on the uneven ground. My hands were slick with sweat, knuckles white as I gripped the wheel, trying to put as much distance between me and that maniac as possible. In the rearview mirror, I saw him, just a flicker of his silhouette as he staggered to his feet, still clawing at the burning flare. But he didn't follow. He just stood there, watching as I drove away, his figure fading into the darkness until he was nothing but a memory. By the time I reached the nearest town, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me drained, numb. I parked outside a diner, stumbled inside, and must have looked like hell because the waitress didn't ask any questions. She just handed me a cup of coffee and nodded when I asked about a police station. Turns out that guy wasn't some random lunatic. He was known around these parts, a backwoods recluse with a reputation for stalking campers. Rumored to be into all sorts of twisted stuff, animal sacrifices, cult rituals, you name it. Locals called him Hollow Jack. The police had tried to catch him before, but he was slippery, like a shadow in the woods, and the authorities had no luck finding him that night either. Just a trail of burnt leaves and shattered glass where my camper had been. They found his camp a week later, deep in the forest, hidden among the trees. The sheriff called me down to identify a few things they'd found. My broken flare gun, for one. But there were other items, things that turned my stomach just looking at them. Jars filled with, well, it's better left unsaid. Let's just say Hollow Jack had been collecting more than firewood out there. The sheriff leaned in, his voice low. He's still out there, probably watching folks, just like he did you. It wasn't my first job, and it sure as hell wasn't supposed to be my last. But something about that night didn't sit right from the beginning. Maybe it was the silence on the dispatch call or the way the wind howled across the San Rafael desert as if it knew something I didn't. I should have listened to that instinct, the one that makes your gut twist and your hands clench the steering wheel tighter than usual. But when the money's right, sometimes you take a job you wouldn't otherwise. The rig hummed beneath me as I barreled down I-70 heading west. The sky was bruised with the last light of day, purple streaks fading into a storm building on the horizon. I had a long way to go and no time to waste. They said the cargo was sensitive, needed to be kept at exactly 20 degrees, and if I messed up, there'd be hell to pay. That wasn't what bothered me, though. What bothered me was not knowing what the hell I was hauling. When they don't tell you what's in the trailer, it's never good. My name's Roy Mallister, bones to the few truckers who still know me on the road. 45 years old, and I've spent the last 20 behind the wheel. The road used to be a kind of escape for me, then a way to outrun the things I didn't want to face. But that was before Carol passed, before I let everything else fall apart, including my relationship with my daughter, Emily. Haven't talked to her in years, and I don't think about it much anymore. I'm good at avoiding things like that. But tonight, something felt different. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of me, just red rock and dry air as far as the eye could see. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which was fine by me. The last thing I needed was distractions. That is, until the dashboard flashed red and the trailer's cooling unit flickered for the first time. I muttered a curse, pulling the rig over onto the shoulder. I cut the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed out into the gathering dusk. The wind hit me hard, dust swirling around my boots as I made my way to the back of the trailer. I could hear the cooling unit working and stuttering like it was trying to fight off some kind of malfunction. Fumbling with the latch, I yanked open the back door and was greeted with a gust of frigid air. It smelled wrong in there, like cold metal and something decayed, the kind of smell that sticks in your nose and won't leave. I shined my light into the back, trying to figure out what was causing the problem. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping. No, not tapping, scratching. It was coming from the crate, a large wooden crate strapped down in the center of the trailer, covered in heavy chains. My heart started to pound in my chest, the kind of adrenaline spike that tells you to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. I inched closer, flashlight trembling in my grip. The scratching got louder. The crate shifted just slightly, as though something inside was alive. "What the hell?" I whispered, backing away. I wasn't going to open it. Not in a million years. I slammed the trailer door shut and locked it tight, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Whatever was in that crate, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was just supposed to get it from point A to point B, no questions asked. I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. Some government experiment or something. None of it mattered. All I had to do was deliver the damn thing. The radio crackled to life as I accelerated and I jumped in my seat. Static, then through the fuzz I heard something faint. A voice. A woman's voice. "Roy, why didn't you come back?" My heart stuttered. The voice sounded like Carol's. I smacked the side of the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the static only grew louder. The voice faded, replaced by an eerie, distorted country song, one I hadn't heard since she passed. It was one of her favorites. "No," I muttered, turning the radio off. This was just stress getting to me. The isolation, the weird cargo, and the fact that I hadn't slept in 2 days, that's all it was. That's what I told myself as I sped down that endless stretch of highway. But the farther I drove, the worse it got. The storm hit an hour later, and with it came the figures. I thought they were just shadows at first, shapes in the mist thrown up by the desert sandstorm. But as the wind howled and the sand lashed against the windshield, I could swear I saw them. People walking along the roadside. No, not people. Ghosts. Old men in trucker caps, women in long, flowing dresses, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark as the night. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying not to look. If I didn't look, they weren't real. That's how it works, right? I blinked hard, forcing my eyes back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was watching me, following me. The trailer lurched hard like something had slammed into the back of it. "What the hell?" I shouted, swerving the rig as I fought for control. My headlights cut through the dust, illuminating the desolate highway, but there was nothing there. Nothing but empty miles. The trailer shook again. Then came the knocking. Loud, rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the inside of the crate. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was done pretending it was nothing. I was done lying to myself. I had to stop. I had to see what was in that crate. I pulled the rig to the side of the road again, hands trembling as I jumped out of the cab. The wind whipped sand into my face, stinging my eyes, but I didn't care. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox and made my way to the back of the trailer. The knocking hadn't stopped. It was louder now, more urgent. With a deep breath, I unlocked the trailer and threw the doors open. The cold hit me again, but this time it wasn't just the refrigeration. There was something wrong about it. The air inside was thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I raised the crowbar, jammed it under the lid of the crate, and pried it open. And then everything stopped. The wind, the knocking, even the pounding of my own heart. Inside the crate, nestled in layers of straw and old cloth, was something small. It looked like a statue, a human skull, but blackened with strange symbols carved into the bone. It seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was breathing in time with me. And then the whispers started. Not from the radio this time, but from the skull itself. Voices swirling in my head, speaking in languages I couldn't understand. But one voice stood out. One voice I knew, Roy. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the skull began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The voices grew louder and the wind picked up again, howling around the trailer. I slammed the crate shut and bolted the door. I didn't care what they said. I didn't care what I'd seen. I was getting the hell out of there. I threw the crowbar into the cab, jumped behind the wheel, and floored it. The trailer lurched behind me as I tore down the highway faster than I'd ever driven in my life. The storm whipped around me, and through the swirling dust, I could see them again, the figures. They were closer now, standing on either side of the road, their eyes following me. Some of them looked familiar, faces I'd seen on the road before. Long dead truckers. Friends. Then, as if the storm itself parted, I saw her, Carol, standing in the middle of the road. Her white dress flowing in the wind, her eyes locked on mine. I jerked the wheel, swerving to avoid her, but the rig skidded off the road. The trailer jackknifed as it slid across the desert sand. I barely managed to hang on as the truck groaned to a stop, tilted sideways in a ditch. Silence. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the empty desert, trying to breathe. The storm passed, but I knew it wasn't over. I reached for my phone. No signal. No way out. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw her again, Carol, walking slowly toward me. Her face pale and cold, her eyes filled with something I couldn't understand. "Roy," she whispered, her voice soft but clear in the stillness. "It's time to come home." I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just sat there, waiting as the darkness closed in around me.